Good afternoon.
Afternoon.
Good afternoon, Professor.
Okay, so in last two class we did array. So we know for 1D array, it gives us access to a line of variables and we can access it by a single for loop. And each array, right, for 1D array, you will have a name, data type, and you also need to specify the capacity. Now for the 2D array, you can think of it as a table of the element of the variable, right? And you also have the name, the array name, and also the data type. But instead of just a single capacity, since you have a table of variable, then you need to give a row count and also the column count. Right, so this will be to specify the size of your array. And to access the element in the 2D array, you will need a nested for loop, right? Since you have row and columns involved here. So let's look at the example here, a little similar to the last example we did. But now again, we have a class of 5 students, and let's say we have Alex, Freddie, Jack, Kaylee, and Max. And let's say each of them already have took 3 exams, and you want the program to ask for their exam score of each exam, and we want to calculate their average for the 3 exams for each of them. And once we find the average, we want to find who got the highest average, and we will print the student's name and with its averaged. Okay, so what's our data will look like here? Or what's the data we need here? Okay, CPU said we need a string of double to store the. Okay, we know a string to store the name.
A two-dimensional array with name and integer.
So we have name, and then we need 5 of them to store their name. And then we can have a integer or double type for the score. Now, what's the size of the score? So we know for the name, it's a string type, and we just need a 1D array.
3 by 5.
Okay, so we want to have a 3 by 5. And then, okay, so this will be the string type. And then we have, let's do the score for the integer type. And then we will have a double to calculate the averaged. And this will also be the 1D array. Now, what will the entry here represent? Right, so we know for the average, right, we will expect the first entry to be the average for Alex, the second entry will be the average for Freddie, and so on. Now, what about the score here? Right, we will expect each column are for student. And what does a row represent?
score on one test.
The score on whichever test. So let's say the first row will be for the exam 1, and then you have score for exam 2, and then score for exam 3. All right, so this is what we need to set up. So we'll have string with the name, and we declare the capacity to be 5, and then we will have the 5 students' name. And then we want to declare a 3x5 array for the score. And we need to calculate the average for each student. Okay, and how many tasks do we have here? How do we break down the task? Right, because if you look at it here, the first task, and this will actually be an array task, will be reading the score. And then the second task will be calculate the averaged. Now the third one, to find the highest averaged, will also be an array task. And then we will print the result. Right, so we need a nested for loop to get the score. And what about the second task?
For second task, you also need a nested for loop.
We also need a nested for loop since we need to access the whole table. Now, what about the third task? To find the highest average, do we need a nested for loop for it?
You just need one.
You just need a single for loop, right? Since we to find the highest average, we just need to go through the average array, and that's a 1D array. Okay, so let's start with the first task to read in the score. Now to read in the score, since we have the nested for loop, what should we do for the inner loop and what should we do the outer loop? Or does it matter here?
It doesn't matter, but it impacts where the data goes, like in the order.
Okay, so for this question to read in the score, the goal is to ask for their score for each exam, right? So if you do it by row, right? Go through each exam, then ask for what they get for each exam. And then like once you finish the first exam, do the second exam. After you do the second, do the third exam, right? That's one way you can do it if you want to have the outer loop for the exam, inner loop for the student. Now you can also let the outer loop to be the column. Then what you do is you will read in all the exam score for each student and before you move on to the next one. So for this task, it doesn't matter which you do row as the outer loop or the column as the outer loop. Right? Just be aware how you enter the data. Right, so let's have the outer loop for the row. So I will have int, and then the row will start from 0 up to 2, right? Since we only have 3 exams. And then the inner loop will be for the column. Okay, now what do we do for each entry? So we get in it, we need to ask, so we need to prompt a message as it to enter the grid, right? So we will ask it to enter the, let's say enter score on the, so we need to tell it which exam score you want. So let's say enter score on exam 1, or it should be on exam R, right? The row represent the exam. Now the first row will be index 0. Index 0 represent the exam 1. Index 1 will be exam 2. Index 2 will be exam 3. So we will say enter score on exam R plus 1. For, and then the student, followed by the student, which will be the name. And then we need to tell it which student we are looking at. Any questions here? Right, so we will start with the first row, right? Then it will go through each column. So it will ask you to enter the score on exam 1 for Alex. And once you enter in, we will move on to the next one. And it will ask you to enter the score on exam 1 for Freddie. And then we will move on, ask you to enter score on exam 1 for Jack, and so on. And then after we go through all the exam 1, it will go to the next row. And then it will ask you enter the score on exam 2 for Alex, and so on. Right, so we need to see in, or we need to store the score. Okay, so this will be how we read in all the score. Any questions here? Okay, now let's say we enter in the score. Let's say their score is let's just have some random number here. Okay, so the next, we will want to calculate their average. Now, how do we calculate their average? What should the outer rule be?
Something less than equal to C++ columns and rows and input CN.
Again, to calculate the averaged, we know we need to access the whole table. And we want to calculate the average. Now, how do we calculate the average for ILEX?
Go through column 1.
We will go through everything in column 1. Then you will add up all the score and divide it by 3, since there's 3 exams. Right after
That's what I said.
after the first column, you will move on to the next column. So for this nested for loop, what should the outer loop be?
Column.
It will be the column. Right? And then for each column, we will add up the score in the row respected to that column. So we will have the outer loop for the column. So we start with 0 up to 4. Now in each column, we need to add this total, right? So we need to add the total score of that student all 3 exams. So we will initialize the sum, right? So before we calculate the column, we need to initialize the sum to 0, and then we will add up the row. And you will just add the score to sum. Now, after you go through, you add all the score up for the student, you need to find the averaged, right? So the averaged of the student will equal to our sum, or I can name it. Let me just name it total. So it will be the total scored for all the 3 exams divided by 3.0, where we need to make it a double. So now we have all their average scored stored in the averaged. Okay, finally, we want to find student with higher scored. So we will go through the average, and since average is 1D array, we just need a single for loop. Right, so you can have for int C, start from 0, or you know what, let's do it with, since it's just 1D array, I will just call it index I. So want to go from index I up to 5. So we'll have from 0 to 4. Now before we go through it, what we need to keep track of for the highest scored?
And the maximum.
The maximum what? The maximum score? Okay, so people say index, right? Since we need to print out the name and it's averaged. So we need to keep track of the index, right? Since index give you access to both the student and also their averaged. So we can initialize it with 0. Right? Assume the first one have the maximum scored. And then we will go through the for loop to compare. Right? So we'll check, is the current score greater than the score we have for the maximum index? If it's greater, then we will update the maximum index, since we will find a better solution. So that will be our third task. And once we have that, we can print out the result. Then we can see out. We can print the name. And we can say this student got the highest.
And the for loop, shouldn't it be if averages at I is greater than averages at max underscore I?
Yeah, I think he's right.
Which one?
The find student with highest scores.
In
The-
the,
it
in the
says-
if statement, not in the for loop, in the if statement.
Yeah, in the if statement.
The if statement here, right?
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's not,
shouldn't
it's
it
not
be
score, it's
averages?
average.
Yeah, this should be the averaged. We are comparing the averaged. Right, so we are comparing the average scores, which is storing the average array. Okay, so once we find out who got the highest scored, then we can print out the person's name, and then we can say this person got the highest averaged of, and then we can print their average out. And again, it will have the index, the maximum index. So that will be the whole program. Any questions here? So if you look at the code here, so this is again pretty much what we just did here. Right, so we initialize the student in the class, right? So this is already fixed. So we assume the first column for our data, right? It's all for the ILEX. And then the second column here, or the second entry for the average, will be for the Freddie, and so on. Now to read in the score, we do row by row. If you want to do column by column, that's also fine, right? So to read in the score, it doesn't matter which order you do it. Then to find their averaged, you need to add up the scored in each column. So you need to have the outer loop for the column, and every time you go in for a column, you will add up the row for that column. So you have the inner loop for the row. So we will calculate the averaged, and once we find the averaged, we can find who got the highest average, and we will keep track of the index since we want to access to the person who got the highest average.
I think you have to fix the scores here as well in the if statement to make it averages.
Let me see. Yes. Okay. So let me run the code here. So it will ask you to enter the score on exam 1 for IELTS. So let's do 30. And then it will ask you the exam 1 score for Freddie. And so on. And after you go through the exam 1, it will move on to the exam 2. So once we enter all the score in, it will tell you Kaylee got the highest average of 70. Any questions here? Okay, here's the code. Are we good? Okay. So now we will move on. So array can also be used as an input. Here is a typo. Okay, so array can also be used as an input data for functions. So we can also do functions with array. So that will give us access to more powerful function, or when you're trying to repeat doing a task with array, we can write a function for it. Then we need to know how we call a function with the array as the argument. So how we use the function if we want to use array as the input, right? So one question we will ask is how do we use it? And one question is how do we set up? So how do we write a function that involves an array? So let's say we want to have so let's say we have an array data with 5 number. And we want to find the maximum number in this array. Then to call a function, we will supply the array name as an input, but you don't need to use any box. Right, so we know when we declare array, we will put the capacity or the row count or column count in the box. Depends on we have 1D or 2D array. Now to call a function in to call a function with the array as the argument, you will just call by its name. Like just have the name as the argument. You don't need to have you don't need to put the capacity. So here, right, if we want to find the maximum value of this array data, then you would just put the array name in. Now, another thing you need to be aware is when we pass in the array, so we know every array will have a capacity, well, it will have a size. But when we pass into the function, the C++ doesn't know how big is your array. So a way to help C++ run the program is we will help it. So when we pass the array as the parameter, we will also give the array size. So instead of passing just the array name, we will also give the size of the array that we're passing. So we will put in 5 here. Okay, so this will be how we call a function with the array as the input. Then to write this function, right, we need to know how to set up the title line. Right, once we know how to set up the title line, the code of our function is pretty much work like how we write function before. Right, you will write the body of your code in the block. Okay, so to set out the title line, like how we did before, we will always have the result data type. So wherever the result you want to return, you need to specify the data type. So if you look at our question here, we will return the maximum value of the data. So we'll expect that to return an integer. So we will have an int followed by the array name. So this is the same as how we write a function before. Now we need to look at how we pass in the parameter. Now for the parameter, it's the same as how we do array declaration, which you will have the data type for the array, right? So we want to pass in an integer array. So we will have int, and then we will pass in an array. But we will leave the capacity empty, which means, so for our example here, our data is a 1D array. So we will just leave the box here empty without any number in it. Now, since I said before, when we pass in the array to a function, right, the C++ doesn't know how big is your array. So to help C++, we will also tell the function how big is our array size. So the second parameter will be the capacity. And then we can write the body of our code. So pretty much how we find the maximum before, we will find, we will do the same thing in the body of the code. So we will use a for loop to access the array. So to find the maximum value, so we need to declare, so we can have int. Now we want to find the answer, right? The answer will store the maximum value. And we can just initialize it with the first entry. And then we will go through the for loop. We can have I starting from, and since we initialize the answer with the first variable, you have a choice here. You can either, if you want to start with 0, it's fine. Then you will just start comparing the answer with itself and then move on. Now, if you want to start with 1, that's also fine. Then you will just start comparing the first value with the second value. Now, for this for loop, right, we know we will start with a 0. What number do we check up to?
Cap.
Cap.
Okay, so it will be the I less than the cap, the size. And then we have I plus plus. And then in the for loop, we will compare if the value is greater than our answer, then we will update the answer. And then we will return the answer. Okay, so the body of the code, right? How we find the maximum value is the same as how we do it if it's in the main program. And the reason we have a function to it, so we don't need to do it over and over again if you want to find the maximum value of different array. You just need to code it once, and whenever you want to find a maximum value in an array, you can just call on the function to do it instead of write this for loop all over again. Okay, I see people asking about the title line. So for the title line, so when we will pass to set up the parameter. Right, so if you look at it, we want our first input to be an array. Right, so if you want to set up a parameter as an array, we will, so you will do it as how we declare an array. The only difference is you will leave the capacity blank, but you will still have this box here to show you have an array. So this shows you have an integer array. But if you just pass in the array, if you just have the argument for the array, your program don't know how big is your array. So you should also tell your program what's the size of your array. So we have the actual parameter for the size. So that's the advice you will have when you are trying to set up function with the with arrays. So depends on you have 1D array or 2D array, you will want actual parameter for capacity or number of rows and columns. Okay, I see people asking, can we pass array by reference with the %? No. When you want to call a variable by reference, right, it can only be done with the variable. With the array, whenever you pass a array into your function, it's already been treated as by reference, which means whatever change you made in the function, it will be permanent. It will change your actual data. So even you don't put the %, by passing this array, whatever change you made to that array, it's permanent. So when you pass in an array to your function, it's being treated as by reference. So you don't need to put %. And in fact, if you put %, in front of the array, here you will get a compiler error. Your program will not compile. Okay, now I see people ask, what about, can we do an example of 2D array? So let's say, let me make some space here. So let's say you have array, that's 2D array. So let's say you have a 2x2 array, and it stores 1, 2, 3, 4. Right, so let's call it data 2. So your data 2 look like this. And let's say you still want to find the maximum of this 2D array. And let me just call the array 2 for now. So to pass in the array as an argument, you just need to pass in the name. And again, we should have the actual parameter for the size. Right, so it will have 2 rows and 2 columns. Okay, I see people asking, how do we put 2D array as a parameter? Now let's look at the title line. So we want to return an integer, max 2. Okay, so we will have it will be how we declare the 2D array, right, with the 2 box. Now, instead of leaving it both blank, like for 1D array, we just leave the capacity blank, right? So here, if you look at it, it's blank. Now for the 2D array, you need to supply the column count, but leave the row count empty. So the first box here, you will leave it empty. Now the second box, you will give the column count. If you leave both blank, the program won't compile. Okay. And since we have 2D array, we also give the size of the array. So we will have the row count. And we also have a column count. And then you will write the body of the code to find the maximum. Right, so for here, again, you can have the answer, you will initialize it with the first entry. And then since you just want to find the maximum number in your 2D array, then it really doesn't matter you go through the row first or the column first. So you will go from row from 0 up to the input size. And then R++.
Wouldn't you set answer to be A of 0, 0?
Yes, 0, 0. And then we will go through the column up to the column count. And then you check if the entry is greater than the answers, then we will update the answers. And then we will return the answers.
I have a question.
Mhm.
So since the parameter calls is also a parameter, but you have to specify the column size anyways when you do int a brackets. Like, why do we really need an int calls parameter?
Yes, because okay, so this 2 here you put in is like you can think of as you telling the C++, you have like a 2D array here.
Oh, okay.
But the C++ is dumb, so it still don't know what's the size, even though you have it here. But when you write in your code, you have no access to the size, so you kind of need to
Oh.
manually give a size.
Okay, thank you.
Right, so I see people asking, so if you have an array of 3 by 3, when you want to set up the parameter, then you will have A with the empty box for the row, and then for the column, you will have the 3. Yes. So you need to give the column count. So if you leave the column count blank, you will get a compiler error. Okay, so we will end it here. Next class, we will do a more exercise with the function involving the array. Okay,
Thank you, Professor.
have a nice weekend.